Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lada Srokoput. I'm a director of exhibitions here at the gallery. I'm delighted to introduce Sean Landers, a New York-based artist who's been creating and exhibiting since the early 90s. Sean's diverse practice encompasses painting, drawing, sculpture, photography, and video. His work is featured in numerous museum and public collections, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, Tate Modern, Desta Foundation, Gustavus Museum, and the Brooklyn Museum of Art, among others. His most recent institutional exhibition closed this March at Le Musée de la Chasse et de la Nature in Paris. Joining Sean today is Ben Luke, a writer and critic for the art newspaper and the Evening Standard, as well as the host of a Brush With podcast. We're thrilled to have them both here to discuss Sean's new body of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sean, I wanted to begin by talking about how meaningful this body of work seems. There's a very distinctly personal quality to these paintings. They're paintings of animals and they involve text, but they very much reflect you. Would you say something about that?
They do. I think I am writing about aspects of myself, and I view the animals as sort of me in some way, and stand-ins for myself.
Yeah.
So, any more specifically about any of the texts?
Well, this is the interesting thing, because one thing that if you've seen the show, you'll see is that people are engaged, that the animals are engaging us quite often.
Yeah.
And it's a very deliberate attempt of yours to, even though they are sort of correct in terms of their anatomy, as it were, that you want to lend a human quality to those pictures.
Yeah, I tend to do that to their eyes and their expressions a little bit. But I mean, where I think I really am in these works is in the writing. And throughout, writing has been the center of my practice since the early 1990s. And if there's a through theme throughout it all, the writing is sort of always explaining what an artwork is in one way, what art is in a way, who I am, and by the virtue of me being like most people, what people are. So I think it encompasses those four things generally. So we can obviously find examples where it doesn't. But that's, I think, what I think unifies the writing from the earliest days in the 90s to what we're seeing here. And in this show, I didn't really start it with a theme or a story arc that I wanted to cover. But as I wrote it, I started to see sort of portraits of who I was as an artist. Like in The Rabbit, there's more of a neurotic thing. And when I was earlier in my career and fearing the end of, once I had a career, I became very afraid that I would lose my career. So I think that sort of neuroses that's sort of depicted in the rabbit painting downstairs, in the text in that painting, I think sort of encapsulated me then. And
it says, "I am prey."
Yeah.
And did you feel that the pressure of being an artist, a young artist in
yes,
an art world that
because
can eat you up?
I went from totally obscure to being quite well known, even internationally, in a very short span of time. And whenever that happens to somebody, there is just naturally sort of a target on their backs. As people, I think, in criticism likes to, at least give it a little bit of for lack of a better term, sort of a rough time, but it's to try it, to test it. And so I was sensitive to that, and I think that's what I was sort of, that was a little bit in my character and in the mood that my work took in the 90s. There was sort of a talking to the audience, and sort of, in my text paintings then, it was a real, I felt like I was in dialogue with the audience. And as I got older and I realized I'm not going to vanish, as I was afraid, I think the writing could relax and to go into different areas. So then the text on the bear painting downstairs, I think, or in this owl painting here, is more like who I feel like where I am now. So I felt like in this show, loose, very, very loosely, if the animals are portraits of me in a way, and the text is as well, it's encompassing from early times to now.
Right, absolutely. The bear painting you see, I think, as in a way summarising the show in a way that other works might represent different aspects. That painting encapsulates it all to a certain degree. Is that fair?
It encapsulates, I think, where I stand in my work now, and it's a more of a sort of a I don't know, I hesitate to say philosophical, but sort of standing back and thinking like, well, in the grand scheme of things, the way I end that, I like very much. Just saying like, when you think of like how big the universe is and how small our planet is, isn't it wonderful that we are here in this little planet falling in love and making art? It is wonderful when you think about it, and it is.
Right.
So, and I think when I was younger, I thought things had to be bigger than that, had to be like, spicier than that or something. And then as I got older, I realized that is enough. And that is big in its own way to have that sort of revelation.
Yeah, and in a way, that sort of dilemma of what art has to be is expressed in the otter painting, where there's this, this idea that you have to incorporate, should I go in the direction of irony? Yeah. Should cuteness be a factor?
So I'm glad you mentioned that one, because when I first painted that, I thought, well, the way I went is, I looked up cynicism because I didn't really want to write it because it has such negative connotations. But then I found, like in Greek philosophy, cynicism is just questioning the way things are. So I thought I was using it in that terms. And I thought, and so earlier part of my career, I was trying to shake things up and make things up. So I was writing on yellow legal pad. I was making wet clay sculptures and very, silly videos and things like that, and throwing them all into the gallery together. So I thought I was, trying to make art new and change the way what it was. And, I was trying to make art out of writing and have it not be literature. So I was, but then as I started to show, I felt there was more of an ironic distance, and I started doing my character, and then as I got older, now it seems to be cuteness, which is the thing. But then I realized, like, oh, maybe I have it wrong. In the beginning, that characterizing myself as that bad boy artist or wherever I was, maybe that was the cuteness, and the irony in the middle, and maybe now this is the most cynical thing at all. But I hate that view. I mean, I like to think this is the most sincere thing, but then when I look into my soul, I wonder, like I'm like, what am I doing? I'm making these very adorable animals, and so is that cynicism? Do I not trust the world to accept really who I am, and I have to cloak myself in this? Is that cynicism? So it's an open question, and I don't know the answer to it.
Right, but it seems to me that you're asking that question of your audience as well. You're saying, okay, I'm going to represent an animal here. It's going to meet you in the eyes, and in doing so, that in a way that provokes that question.
It does, and I mulled it over, and I kept flipping back and forth. Is this now truly cynical? And I had the order wrong in the otter painting. But I think I came to that, no, I'm overthinking it, and I'm just turning it over too many times in my head. And no, I think I really do want to make these paintings.
Right, yeah.
But it's healthy to question yourself and not just go on autopilot and say, this works, I'll keep doing more. So anyway.
Well, it seems to me that the text has that consistent thing right from the start, and here, and the painting, in fact, of the wolf over here. There's this wonderful thing where there is this really actually profound thought about what we are on this earth, how relatively insignificant we are, frankly, across the billions of years of the universe, and how ultimately we die, we are returned to the earth, and if we're lucky, our nutrients enter tree roots, are hit by the light of the sun and turn into leaves on a tree, and then but you end it at the furthest extreme of the painting by saying, oh, fuck it, let's get drunk.
Yeah, well.
And there's that, in a way, you're questioning yourself as well as the audience. There's all sorts of questions. It's abundant with questions.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things being portrayed there. There's that thought. But what's also being portrayed there a thought pattern that we all have, and we all go down those cul-de-sacs where there's no answer. And what do? You get drunk or whatever else you can do to sort of relieve, the pressure of that kind of thinking.
Right, but also it seems to me it's about the painting, the act of painting, and how valid is it to paint, and you're asking that question, that idea that you express in the Bear painting, to paint about love,
yes,
to paint about happiness. It
yes.
seems to me is quite courageous right now.
Well, I hope I like that thought. Yeah, I hope so, but. Yeah, I think painting, making art is one way, writing, making music, doing anything that's creative and where you produce something is one of the ways in which you can stave off the weight of, thinking of eternity and our place in eternity. And even though no art lasts forever, our planet won't last forever, our solar system won't last forever. It's hurtful to think of these things, but these are the things that you think of when you're in the business of making things that last at least hundreds of years more than you do. And it's the most uncool thing for artists to think about and to openly express. I have many artist friends, and if I talked to them about this, they would, shame me out of it or make fun of me, and I'd be fine with that. But it truly is a lot of the content of art making, and if I'm really exposing what it is to make art, I have to talk about that, I feel.
Right.
And I like to talk about it.
Absolutely. You talked about how the planet's not going to last forever.
Right.
Is there, obviously you're depicting animals, many of which are common and not threatened, but for instance, I don't know the status of mountain lions, but mountain lions may be threatened. And it seems to, can you depict animals today without also reflecting on extinction, without reflecting on the climate catastrophe?
Yeah, I think it's part of it. It's something I think about and care about. And I have solar panels on my house. I drive an electric car, but I can't say that's the content that I'm going after here. I think I'm going after what I've been clumsily trying to describe so far is making art about creativity, about making art. And I think I've always since the early days turned the process of making art inside out and exposed it for what it is, what I think it is.
Right.
How I embody it anyway.
Right. The trees are really significant. They're aspen trees.
Yes.
Tell us about why they're significant. This is a lovely idea, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm an artist who's made lots of different things that look different, but I think they're all unified. Aspen trees, an aspen forest is one plant, and they're all connected underground as a root by their roots. So the biggest living thing on Earth is an aspen forest in Colorado. It's many, many miles, and it's one plant. So I thought that was a nice analogy for an artist's life work. Each tree being a different work, sort of thing. And then also going back to the Rocky Mountains in Aspen, when the westward expansion, settlers would carve their names into the trees, and those carvings are still visible today. Carving your name into something like wet concrete on the sidewalk or a tree is equivalent to making a painting. It's the same impulse as I'm here, So I like that bit about it. And then, so it just made sense. And I didn't have that idea thinking of those things. I was in Madrid and had been in the Prado, so I was already sort of like blown away by art. And then if you go, there's a park behind the Prado, and then you go to this glass. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the Parc de Retiro, I think.
Yes, yeah. So there's all those trees, and they're all carved up. So I was there in like 2014, and I made my first tree painting. Michelle, 2015 or 2014?
I've got 2014.
Yeah, so it happened right after that trip.
Right, okay.
So I thought, I'm gonna go use all my Bosch or my, whatever else I was blown away by in the Prado and go make something, but it was actually the trees outside that got me.
Right, that's great.
But I would have been opened up, to receive an idea, probably from the Prado, but I saw the trees, and then that's where I was like, okay. And then the aspen thing came later. It made sense to use white bark trees with black writing because of my early paintings, which were big white paintings with black writing on them.
Yeah.
So I was looking for something that sort of went back to my early work and brought it forward again, you know.
Yeah, you tested it, didn't you? You tried it with a darker bark. I mean,
I did.
There's like one painting or something where you tested
Well,
that.
yeah,
that
I had
theory.
brown bark with yellow carving. Those were the first couple.
Yeah.
There was some with animals in it in the beginning. And yes, that's right.
These kind of marks in the tree that aren't the writing, it seems to me they're significant compositionally and so on, as well as, you know, reflecting the nature of the tree, because they're like wounds on a body, or
Yeah.
how significant is it to make sure that they have a sort of rhythm through the painting?
Yeah, they're visually composed, and like some of these you'll see ghost writing that I didn't paint on. So I write on them in charcoal, and then if it's not the right place for that text, or the text feels wrong, then I wipe it off as best I can. But I don't totally get rid of it, which I could do, because I like that it looks like a guy made this thing.
Yeah.
You know?
You like the pentimenti,
Yeah,
the historical kind of.
That's another thing in the Prado, when you see all these Velázquez paintings of like horses, you can see like, oh, he tried the horse leg in 3 different positions.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see that.
Yeah, that's great.
Anyway, not comparing myself, of course.
No, but so you're composing the tree. So they're very much composed, in other words.
Yeah.
So the wounds or the cuts in
Yeah.
the tree are very clear.
I usually am pretty good at first time, but when I'm not, I don't mind rubbing it off and replacing it. And it's composed, like visually, as well as, you know, as a writer would.
Right, and the kind of that amazing root network below ground is a kind of metaphor for the idea of ideas in your career, kind of surfacing, resurfacing.
Exactly.
This network of ideas, of which these are a great example of. You know, as you talked about the 2014 origin of the trees and text. Signposts have been in your work since 2018.
Yeah.
There are animal paintings, quite straight animal paintings in your work from 20 years ago or so.
Yeah, there are.
So there's a real sense in which you're looking across your career and uniting certain bodies.
I am, yeah. It's sort of how I work. Is I'll remember something fondly from my own past and think like, well, I didn't do as much with that as I felt like I could, because I probably had some other idea I was urgently trying to get out then. So I'll pick it up and maybe add another string of something else that maybe I'd done at a different point, and then add something new, twist it together, then I have a new thread, which can then be later combined. A good example, since you said the signpost paintings, you go before them and you have the bookshelf paintings.
Yeah.
You go before them and you have the stripe paintings. And you go before them, the stripe paintings were made because I was exhausted of doing stream of conscious. So instead of writing my thoughts, I would take different colors of paint and go across. So it hops all the ways back. And you're right, the underground root system to connect it all was my way of saying that everything I do might look different, but it's all part of the same effort. And I think when you like on my website, you can see everything chronologically. You can see everything, things come and go, and you can see that it's not as, there's not as much non sequitur as it might appear at first glance.
Right. And I'd really advise everybody, if you have not looked at Sean's website, it is a wonder, and it's fantastic because it gives you the means of making a visual search, and that's a really wonderful capacity, I think. If you can look through an artist's oeuvre and you can see these visual reflections and not just gain it from wonderful art historians in museums and so on, it makes a massive difference, because it is fundamentally, you're in dialogue with yourself, right?
I am,
in
yeah.
the studio. You know.
And notably other people, like William Hogarth and Picasso and Magritte and Picabia.
Right.
I mean, I bring them in for inspiration, and, you know, I'm glad none of them are alive to see what I've done.
Are there any particular art historical reference in these works?
Oh, I don't know. Good question. I'm not aware of it.
I mean, it's interesting because, of course, what you pick up from art history takes several forms. It's not just about imagery, of course. It's about language. And there's some of Picabia, I think, in some of the directness, the deliberate, in a way, the kind of straightness, but the odd straightness, I'd say, of the compositions, of some of those later Picabias, for instance.
Yeah, well, I think my life model is from Picabia. If you've ever seen a catalog raisonné of him, he changes throughout his whole life. And when I saw that, you know, in the early 90s, I came across a book of everything he's done. I thought, I recognized, like, that's what I need to be. I can't be somebody who refines something over decades and just slightly changes it every so years. I can't do that. I have to have the radical changes. And it was his life output that gave me the confidence to do that. So I memorialized that throughout my work too. If you've noticed, there's a 709 series through the titling. Mm-hmm. There's a little painting that Picabia made in the, oh boy, I'm not going to be good at the dates here, but I think it was in the teens. It was a squiggle, like kids do, and then all the different bubbles are different colors. Yeah. And he was making fun of abstraction, so he gave it a random number to just be funny, and he called it 7091. So I did my 7092 painting, which was a squiggle filled with different colors of writing. And then once I had that, then I did a stripe painting that was 7093, and I did Picasso paintings where all these Picasso images are overlapped, and that's called like 7094. And then I unified different series of mine with 709s as a sort of a callback to Picabia, and almost like acknowledging him for being my model of don't be afraid to keep changing style and changing form.
Right.
It'll just give me a much more enjoyable life,
right,
you know,
absolutely.
and more fun in my studio. I mean, it's way more fun to be able to change it up.
Right, absolutely.
For me, not for everybody.
Right, of course. And but I think that's another really important means. I talked about images and language before, but actually what artists from history can do is act as a kind of moral example. That's the term that Matisse used to use about Cézanne. You know, it was about not just about what they produced, but their attitude to it. And sometimes that is as much of an example as anything. It's about how their career can lead as a kind of example to yours.
Right.
And I see that a lot in. I think a lot about the fact that you picked up very strongly on Hogarth.
Yeah. Because
he's an artist that was able to treat issues of the utmost seriousness.
Yes.
With an incredibly absurd eye and satirical eye, and do it and come out with something incredibly serious. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, they're wonderful.
Can you say something about that kind of balance of serious,
sure.
The kind of role of humour, because there is a lot of humour in your work.
Yeah. When the beginning part of my career, there was not a lot of image making, and there was a lot of writing, and writing on paper at first, and cartooning, and then I was doing this with oil paint on unstretched linen canvases, and I was looking for a way, and then so I was sort of a storyteller in a way, and I was always lampooning myself. I had noticed in my writing a pattern of self-aggrandizement and then self-effacing, and it'd go over and over and over again. It was like a perpetual motion machine for art making. Is this sort of ego up, ego down, ego down. I hate myself, I love myself, over and over. So I gave each character. I gave the clown self-effacing and chimpanzee self-love. And I had those as characters for a while, but I was looking to expand beyond that. And I came across Hogarth, and I saw the cartoony nature of serious social issues. And I thought, well, maybe I'll do this. So rather than growing up in 18th century London, I grew up in 20th century Massachusetts, which was a very, it has, a lot of the towns in Massachusetts still have a little bit of colonial flavor, so I sort of superimposed my Hogarthian characters in a New England tavern and have them getting drunk. And where I went to college, there was a British art museum, and they had this one Hogarth painting there called The Midnight Modern Conversation, in which Richard Phillips, who's here today, brought to my attention. And I used that painting and pulled characters out of that to sort of do this thing. And the story I was telling in this time was basically how my friends and I got to close to the age of 30. I was more time to get just a little bit serious. It's not about carousing. It's not about staying in the bars late at night anymore and settling down. And that's kind of the story I was thinking about telling through that. But anyway, it was a cigar that exploded in my career. It was almost a disaster before it became sort of a badge of pride and honor. But I lost galleries from that show. And
Is that right? Wow.
I did. And we don't have to say who they are, but there's 3 major galleries that said, I don't want to show this guy anymore. He's too unpredictable. And, I think it's proven over time that it's okay that I'm unpredictable and that good things come of it if you just let me off the leash a little bit. So, but at the time I was a guy who was supposed to be making unstretched text paintings and maybe a video and occasional sculpture, and to throw out these crazy Hogarth paintings was just, a mad thing to have done.
That's great. Well, how wonderful that you did it.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the source material for these works. Where do you get your images of animals from?
The internet, because I cannot be crawling around looking for animals with a camera. So I have the idea kind of which animal I want to paint, and then I comb through images on the internet and find sort of what I'm imagining for that canvas. And then I usually either make up a background, which is in all of these in this room, except for that one is a photograph I took of the continental divide where the mountain line is, which is the ridge in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado where water flows one way toward the Pacific and the other way toward the Atlantic.
Right.
So I wanted that location in that one because I thought I could do something topically or theme-wise with a text. And it was too construed and I couldn't get there. So I ended up saying that, which is the naked, what a painting is,
Right.
We petition eternity for survival. I forget what I wrote. Something
Posterity.
Like that. Right, yeah.
That's right, absolutely.
Right, so.
You mentioned that you decide which animal you want to paint.
Yeah, so I've been...
How does that process work?
Yeah, well, I ran through a lot of animals when I was doing my Tartan animal series, and of those I had some favorites that I wanted to revisit. So when I knew I was making a show for London here, I just chose a couple of my favorites, and I love the European red deer, and love the black bear, and as animals, and obviously this was a new one for me, and I really like the great horned owl. And I was trying to choose animals also that were not all North American, so many of these are here in the UK as well.
And tell us about the painting of it, because one of the things that I think is really clear when you're really up close to them is that there's a lot of what seems to me must be quite meditative action. It will be time consuming, and it will take and you must be at the face of the canvas for long periods of time. So tell us about that.
Well, I am, and I have. Some days it's music and my thoughts, and other days it's audiobooks. So
yeah, and that just sort of keeps you going.
When it's fur, then it's usually audiobooks. But when it's composition and things like that, it's I don't want any words in my head. So it depends. There's bigger areas in the painting, like how do you put this thing together? That's not a time to be listening to someone else's words.
Right, absolutely. And talking about other people's words, one of the things, of course, that you do by arranging text in an order which is not straight lines and prosy, is that you conjure the idea of poetry. And I wonder if your text emerges from reading as well as your own thoughts.
It does, but probably my first artistic impulse when I went through puberty as a kid was to be a poet, to write poetry, and I was also, sort of forced to paint. My grandmother was a small-town oil painting teacher, as was my mother, so I had to paint, and it wasn't something I wanted to do. It was just sort of like they said, this is your time to paint. So I'd sit down and paint. So, but when I had, my creative bursts, it was like horrible teenage poetry, you know? So, I had this next event not happened, I wonder where I would have been. So my mom said, you're such a good writer, I want you to go to the best English teacher in school and show her all your poems. So I brought a whole bunch over to her on a Saturday at her house, sitting at her dining room table, and she read each one, and she goes like, horrible, these are terrible. And after a while, she was like, you're not really gonna kill yourself, are you? It's like, no. I was so humiliated that she, as I was leaving, she gave me a Robert Frost book, thank you, and said, here's a real poet. And he was living he used to live in a neighboring town to mine, along with Emily Dickinson, which is an amazing riches for poets living next door. Well, they were long dead by the time I was born, but you know what I mean. They were the local heroes for where I grew up. So, you know, she said, you're good at, aren't you good at drawing and painting? You should do that. So I was like, okay. So here I am, you know, I write still and also paint. So.
But it's interesting that she gave you the book. She said, become a painter, but here's a book too.
So, well, if you really want to know what poetry is,
yeah,
here's Robert Frost, he's a poet.
Right.
This is, whatever this shit is you've given me, is like... Stop. Just stop. Right, so.
One thing that you also do, as well as sort of bringing images back, if you like, and creating this, if you like, a collage of earlier works and different bodies of work, is that text appears from the past too, right? There's a sign painting which I think has similar words to the bear painting downstairs.
Absolutely, because I love that piece of writing, so I wanted to give it a second go.
Right.
I wanted to do it again. So, yeah, is it identical text or very close?
Pretty much. There's certainly at least there's chunks of it that are the same.
Yeah. No, that's what I was doing. I was reusing it.
Okay. And is there a time when, in the studio, where you section off, like, this is writing time, this is painting time?
Yes.
Or is it more haphazard than that?
No, there's a wall between it. It's a totally different part of myself. And I can get there rather quickly because I've been writing for so long, but it's not a painting day. It's a different day.
That's very interesting.
Listening to
and are there different spaces as well?
No, same room.
Same space.
But I'll sit at my desk rather than at an easel. But sometimes I'll paint the trees and I'll sit in front of the trees and write on yellow legal pad and let it come to me when I'm looking at what I'm gonna write on. And sometimes I'll make a schematic of the trees and then write on the paper where text would go. But usually it first comes out as on yellow legal pad.
That's great. Well, Sean, it's a really rich body of work. Thank you so much for telling us about it.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would anybody like to ask some questions?
Yes.
Sean, this is a great show. I love the show.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the physicality of the writing in these, and what it means to be carving on trees and finding text carved into signs, and why the text is so often throughout the show like physically, like painted into physicality rather than just written?
Yeah, I think the honest answer is to give it a reason to occupy the same space so it can be in the same world. You know, in the 90s I had a series of surreal images, and then the text would flow through the air like carried on the wind behind the character. And they were from two different worlds, and I think in this the impetus was to make it live in the same world as the image.
Is it also about like memory, like being remembered? Because often I think
Yes, yeah.
Trees is really about this kind of desperate effort to communicate with other people and be remembered, even as an anonymous person.
Yes, you know, as we were talking about, you know, the westward expansion and people in the Rocky Mountains carving in, like, it's that impulse of I want to leave a mark. So absolutely that as well.
It's a metaphor for painting.
Yeah, it's a metaphor for making it, you know, art in general. And that's where I first came to it, was in the park behind the Prado, and where people are doing that exact thing.
Thank you, Richard. That's great. Any other questions?
All right.
Oh, there's a hand gone up at the back.
Yeah.
Matt Collishaw.
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Do you find yourself struggling against improving your technique until you would have it at a degree where you were like a painter of nature?
Yeah.
Down to that David Shep.
Yeah, no,
Might distract from
sometimes I see real, paintings of nature painters, and I feel very humbled, how they'll go every fiber in a feather and things like that. And I don't do that. So,
do you find yourself gradually evolving as a painter over time, anyway, many years, becoming better and better at it?
Yeah.
You've got to stop yourself.
I see that, but I also feel a comfort level of where I'm at with it. And but I think what your remarks remind me of myself maybe 20 years ago, where I didn't have this much facility and I wanted this much facility. And now that I have it, I feel like I've got enough for what I need to say, but I would always take more. And I've got, I think, a few more years to get there. I don't know. Hope so.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Any more major artists want to ask a question? Anybody else got a question?
Yeah.
Can I just ask one thing that I was thinking about with the show is with regards to maybe how our own feelings about a certain type of animal are coming out in these paintings. For instance, are you thinking about these connotations with something like the owl being a sage type of animal, and that's a human thing that we placed onto this?
Yeah.
Is that coming into play when you're choosing which
I
sort of...
I think each species brings with it its own meaning and baggage with it, and I accept whatever that is. And I think if I don't know how conscious I am about that though, other than wanting to sort of make the eyes on each animal look just a little bit more on the human side than on the animal side, to help create that connection between viewer and art object. And one of my theories about art is the way it hits people is one of the ways it hits people is through empathy. And if you can empathize with it, then there's a connection, and through that connection you can get things said. So that's why I try to make that sort of connection in the face, so we can feel ourselves in the faces of each of these. Maybe a little bit more than if you looked at the face of a photograph or the actual face of an animal. But I don't know. I try. I'm looking at them now, hoping I have done that. Right.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Question there?
When you were preparing for this exhibition, did you think about the pieces as a collection and sort of collection of animals, or did you work on each piece individually and then move on to the next animal and the next?
I think I'm hard of hearing, but
Did you think about them as a collection or just as individual works?
in both, because all shows that I make, and I think this is probably true for most artists, you make individual artworks, but for the time of the exhibition, they're going to be together. So you have that 1 month or so in which all of them together say one thing, but after the show ends, they all go to their different directions, and then they speak by themselves after that. Almost, like a family or something like that. So.
Is it particularly significant that the rabbit painting is this rabbit painting, for instance, because there are a number of others, right?
Yeah. I liked how, like I was trying to say earlier, how that one downstairs sort of was like me, a younger version of myself, and this one here is probably an older version of myself, saying the privilege of life is its own reward. So there's a lot more perspective in the 30-odd years that's taken place.
That's great. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming and listening to us. And thank you, Sean, for your
You're
insight
welcome,
into the
and
work.
thank you all as well.